Every right you give away to the government, you'll never get back. So it is imperative that we as citizens stand up for our rights. The more that you know about your rights as a citizen, the more power that you have. All right. Well, my name is John Poe. I'm 55 years old. I began my career in law enforcement in 1990. And throughout my career in law enforcement, I started out as a volunteer helping out, then moved into the full-time position of a police officer. I've held pretty much every position in my department except for chief of police before retiring. When I retired, I went to the Detroit Police Department. I was there working in headquarters. Was there almost 2 years. And then when I left Detroit, I became chief of police for a small department in southeastern Michigan, about 5 miles from the border to Ohio. And, I've seen it all. I've worked, as a detective sergeant, as a patrol officer, a sergeant, a lieutenant, and then chief of police. I just, you wouldn't believe the amount of things that I've seen in those times.
And in that entire super long career in law enforcement, have you ever encountered First Amendment auditors on the job?
Many times. That's when I first started, of course, the internet wasn't that prevalent. You didn't have the big YouTube channels. You didn't have people that were doing a lot of the live streaming or even the edited content, and that quickly grew. As the internet evolved and got to the point where it is now. In the latter parts of my career is when I started encountering First Amendment auditors and those who were trying to invoke their First Amendment rights.
Can you walk me through one of those typical encounters? Like, what kind of tactics did they use, and what were the kind of people you were dealing with?
I can give you two different encounters that are completely different from each other. First one, we had a crew that was working in the Detroit area. I don't know if they were transient, where they would film in one area and then they would move on to another area from that point. But they were, notice had come out. They were going into police lobbies and very loud, very vulgar. Um, and the problem, I don't have a problem with First Amendment auditing. Let me say that first and foremost. I support the Constitution. As both a veteran of the United States Army and as a police officer, I took an oath to uphold the Constitution. Where I have a problem is you come in and you start screaming, you start using vulgarity in front of people, even when you're asked not to do so. You're disrupting what's going on in that office. You want to do a First Amendment audit? By all means, come on in. I'll let you film. There are certain areas where I won't allow you to film, and that's because state and federal law say that the information that's like on a computer screen, I can't allow you into those areas. If I do that, I violate the law. You violate it for filming it. So this crew came in and they didn't like the fact that we had a partial doorway gate that led from the waiting area in the office to the actual desk. And my assistant sat right there, the administrative assistant for the department. And so the guy came up and tried opening the gate, couldn't figure out how to work the lock. So he decided he was just going to push through and break the lock. And he's screaming the whole time. He's calling her, obscenities, calling her the B word, things like that. And I think that she did really well. She handled it. And I was in the chief's office. We were going over some paperwork. I heard the commotion. I came out and what is going on? And, the guy's like, you don't have a right to block our access to this office. And you don't have this right. You don't have that. Well, absolutely we do. Because within 2 to 3 feet of you are personal records of people in these drawers here. And they could be anything from, it was someone had applied for a handicap parking permit. It could have been someone's gun registration that we were waiting to, you'd get them in and you would file them online, and then you had to send the paperwork in. Well, we would wait till we got so many of them together, mail them all at once. And you had like 30 days to mail them in. So you had all these different personal information of people that were there that are not available to the public. And it's been upheld by the courts that you can't do that. These guys decide they're going to start going through, opening up the drawers and start throwing things out of the drawers. When they ended up going to jail, they, that was the first thing they were screaming was it was their First Amendment right to do so. And the judge says, yes, you had a First Amendment right to do it, but you also violated the law when you caused damage to public property by breaking that gate open. And then when you started going in and going through the drawer, and we use their own footage as the evidence in that case. Um, when the prosecutor and the judge asked me, they said, what do what's your recommendation? And I leave it to the court's discretion. But I think that if they realize and they apologize that they shouldn't have been doing that and they shouldn't have been acting that way in the first place, I don't see why we should be keeping them in jail for it. Just, they've got to understand there are laws. We have to uphold laws. And, that one ended. They went on somewhere else and ended up getting arrested 4 or 5 more times within the next 2 months for the same stuff. And we just realized that they were doing it basically for the clicks. They were being as loud and obnoxious as possible for that.
Right.
Yet
And
we had another one come in
can I
and
pause you real quick? Is that
yeah,
okay?
go ahead.
Before that encounter, was there an official policy on how to handle First Amendment auditors, or was this like new ground for y'all?
It was new ground for us. And there wasn't, the policy basically was uphold their rights until they step beyond their rights and what they do causes either a disruption or destruction to property or injury to someone else. They're not violating rights. If they go back into the spaces where it's clearly marked authorized personnel only, there's a reason for that. And it's not because we have some big secret. There's a reason why that office is completely open so you can see what's going on. There was no big secret there. The main point of it was we're protecting the identities and the rights of the citizens. And, it comes down to a matter of whose constitutional right trumps whose. Well, the courts have said in those situations, it's the rights of privacy protection for those people that have came in and willingly given their information to the police department.
And after that encounter, did it shift your policy on how to handle future First Amendment auditors, or did it just like generate more awareness that this is a phenomena that may occur
Yeah.
again?
That was I was the one who was in charge of training, and I did a lot of the policy with the department at that time. And my whole viewpoint on it was just inform the officers and let them know there are First Amendment rights. If someone comes up to you on the street, if they come up to you on the station, they're allowed to film you. You're in public spaces. You don't have a right to get angry. You don't have a right to get offended. You don't have to engage them, but you don't have a right to make them stop. And one of the things that after I became the administrative lieutenant within the department, one of the things that I made very clear to our officers was every time you leave this station and go out on that road, expect there to be at least 10 cameras filming what you're doing. And 2 of those cameras are one is going to be on your chest as your body camera. The other is going to be your in-car camera. So always expect that you're going to be filmed and keep it professional. You can be polite, you can be personable, which I want to see, but remember what you do will be filmed and it can be put out there, and you could end up losing your job because you don't know how to control yourself.
On the flip side of that, do
Mhm.
you think that First Amendment auditors in that case, like maybe people who are doing police watching, is that useful? Does that help keep people
Absolutely.
accountable, or is it more
Well,
provocative?
just like in any profession, any grouping, any community, there are good and bad people in there. And I think that the cop watching in most cases is a very positive thing because you're able to root out who are the bad officers, who are the ones who shouldn't be behind the badge. And you see that so much on YouTube. Unfortunately, you're going to see mostly the negative. You're not going to see the positive that much because it doesn't get the clicks. But you see it with a lot of officers that should have never been behind the badge in the first place. They're coming out and they're acting in ways that they shouldn't. And they are putting not only themselves, and of course, everybody knows not to call me, and I got my phone on vibrate, but, they're not only putting their job in jeopardy, but they're putting the public in jeopardy and they're putting their fellow officers in jeopardy. And our job is to serve and protect the public, not worry about your own personal ego, not worrying about making sure everyone knows you're in charge. There have been many times where people have been very loud, and I've allowed them just be loud, get it out of you if that's what it takes. And then I start, as I'm talking to them more and more, I'll lower the tone of my voice. And as they're getting this anger, aggression, whatever it is they have, you'll notice as that's weaning out of them, they'll start lowering the tone of their voice to where they're not screaming and shouting anymore. They're talking because they have to lower themselves to hear what I'm saying. And there's so many ways you can handle situations. And I think many times you see, well, especially when you look at the YouTube stuff, the way that it's presented by some channels, every officer's a bad person. And that's not the case. 99% of officers do their job and do it the right way. We also don't take into account the fact that when they did studies on it, police officers through their career will experience more post-traumatic stress injuries. It used to be called PTSD, now it's PTSI. They will experience more than most soldiers see in the battlefield.
Wow.
In daily situations, officers are faced with the possibility that they're going to die, that they might see someone else die, that they're going to see the most horrific acts that people can commit on each other. They're hated by a lot of people in the public, period. And you compound those over decades working as a law enforcement officer, sometimes people are going to snap. And for the longest time in law enforcement, it was ignored. And actually, if you wanted to seek social work, counseling, therapist, psychiatric help, you would blacklist your career. If people found out that you were going to, as the saying would be, if you were going to a shrink, you're going to lose your badge. And so for a long time, that was frowned upon. I'm glad to see that now they're finally opening up and realizing officers are seeing huge amounts of trauma daily. And it's time that they start focusing on how to fix the damage that's being done to these officers. And I think that the more we go into it, the more open to therapy that it is, the better you're going to start seeing how officers handle situations.
And does it seem to you that these First Amendment auditors who are entering police stations or maybe approaching police and being provocative, are they simply trying to bait police officers into arguments for those clicks and views?
The ones that I've dealt with and a lot that I've seen that act like that, that's specifically what it seems to be aimed towards is to provoke some kind of reaction out of the officers. And unfortunately, there's quite a few, especially the older officers who weren't around before the internet was big, that fall right into that. But a well-trained officer who understands the Constitution, understands the oath that they took, they're going to be able to handle that situation.
With that in mind, the First Amendment auditors who are approaching and provoking police, do you think their intention is just to get and garner those views online, or do you think they actually have an intention to protect the First Amendment?
Well, I think it's split. The ones who are doing it specifically for YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, and they have a constant pattern of doing that. And you hear the way that they talk about police officers, here, piggy, stuff like that. And first off, let me say the folks that think that, saying something like here, piggy, or here's a donut, those kinds of things, most officers don't give a crap about that. You think it's insulting, but it's not. And we've been called much worse. We've had people spit in our faces. All right. The others that are doing it strictly to defend their First Amendment rights, that's what they're doing. Until you start interfering with others' rights, you have a right to be that way. And there have been cases where you have First Amendment auditors. We actually have a law here in Michigan and this carried over into, I believe it was in 2020 when an arrest was made on it. There was we have a law about noise coming from cars, and that was specifically for these stereos that folks have that literally rattle windows out of houses. So the law came out. One of the biggest problems is you needed a machine that would a decibel meter to accurately depict how much sound was coming out of the cars. And then an officer who wrote someone for it said he didn't have a decibel meter. And you got to remember these things back then were like $5,000, $6,000. So departments weren't throwing out for it. And when he got to court, the judge goes, well, what have you got to prove it? And the officer was able to pull up his body cam to where he could not hear his police radio over the sound coming out of the car. And the judge upheld it, and it was upheld in appellate as far as I recall. Well, when you start thinking about that, when someone comes into your police lobby, and most police lobbies, your dispatch is right there, unless you're in the bigger departments. So the officer or the dispatcher who is handling 911 calls, and they're also dispatching police, and most times, most departments, they're dispatching police and fire. So if that person cannot effectively function because of what those folks are doing, they're violating, and they can find themselves in trouble for it. And it's been upheld in court before.
Would you also say that First Amendment auditors can draw resources away from parts of the community that may need more help, like an emergency?
Well, I think that anytime that you interfere with the ability of the department to function properly, that can be a drain on the resources. And it's not a drain on the resources of the department, it's a drain on the safety factor for the citizens.
Okay. Did you ever have it? Did you ever have a situation like that where you're busy dealing with these auditors and something more important was going on elsewhere, and then it made you late to the situation?
Well, one of the things about it is with our dispatch and the way that it works, uh, until my last couple of years on the job, and that I had already been a detective at that point, so I was away from the uniform division, and then I became the administrative lieutenant. Up to that point, the commanding officer would be the person who was the dispatch officer and the command officer for the shift. So if I came in and I was the sergeant for the shift, it would be my job that I was going to be in charge of my officers on the road. I was also going to handle dispatch at the same time. So I've had situations where that happened, but I'm not going to let them interfere with my ability to make sure that my officers get dispatched properly. And I've literally been in the station when they've come in and they're screaming and yelling, and I was a road officer and not the command officer, and they're screaming and they're yelling, they're demanding my badge number. Well, we get a 911 coming in. I'm not going to stand around and give you my badge number. I'm not going to stand around and talk to you. I'm not going to engage you on these things. I just walk right out and get in the car and go. So me personally, I just would never let that happen. You're not going to stop me from answering an emergency call just because you think you have a right to do so.
All right, that sounds like it was the right thing to do. Um, can we clearly define what spaces are considered traditional public forums and where maybe First Amendment auditors are crossing the line and testing the boundaries of where that
Well,
first?
the way
Yep.
it's generally been understood, and the way I've always understood it, was any space that was directly open to the public and was publicly owned, which means like sidewalks, the streets, public parks, government buildings, those kinds of things. So you see people all the time going up to, say, we call it Secretary of State in Michigan. It's all called BMVs or DMVs. You'll see them walking up into the lot of a DMV or a Secretary of State, and you'll see security come up. Oh, this is private property. You have to get out of here. No, that property is either owned or rented by the government, and it's maintained by the government. You are security hired by the government to be there to secure the property. You don't have a right to tell a person they can or can't be there just because you don't want them to film. That's considered public space. And so if you're walking down the sidewalk and you're filming in through the windows of, it could be a jewelry store, it could be a lingerie store, it could even be a gun shop. And you're walking down the sidewalk and you're filming in through those windows, that is also considered public access. If you can readily view it from public space, then it falls under the protection of that. So you get these people who are shop owners coming out screaming, you don't have a right to film. Well, that's easily handled. Pull your drapes, close the blinds. You don't want them seeing in, that's how you handle it. But you can't stop someone from filming. And I'm sorry if feelings get hurt because that's what happens, but that's their constitutional right.
What about cities who have film permits or they require film permits for storytelling, whether that's like fiction or maybe nonfiction?
I've
Um,
I've never encountered them, but I personally look at it as it is a violation of the constitutional rights. If you're someone who is out there First Amendment auditing, you're not, and you're filming for yourself for your own personal records. It doesn't matter if you're going to upload it to YouTube or not. If you're filming for your own personal records and you're not doing it as a commercial means, then it's a First Amendment right. I don't see how they can tell you you can or cannot film.
and I've heard a criticism of certain auditors like Nasty Nathaniel and First Amendment rights. They film in traditional public forums like the sidewalk, filming
Mhm.
restaurants and other businesses. Um, and then the criticism of them is they aren't technically auditing because members of the public can't violate your First Amendment rights. Like, do you need to be in a position of authority with the government to violate someone's First Amendment rights?
No, see, that's where I think that a lot of people have it mistaken, is how can you charge someone with violation of constitutional rights if they're not a government employee, but challenging it as a non-government official or someone who's just a member of the public challenging it? How is that any different? There are a lot of people who get arrested, they get sued for violation of constitutional rights. So if someone comes out of a restaurant and says, you can't film here, that's a challenge to a constitutional right. Those folks need to be educated, and that's why I like Nasty Nathaniel's techniques, is because he's non-confrontational. He always tries to have a conversation with people, even if they want to be idiots, they want to be rude, they want to be threatening. He still doesn't take it to that level with them. And I've personally done First Amendment auditing, and I try to mirror the auditing that I do after Nasty Nathaniel. So I think that he does it in the proper way. Here's another point to that question, is if no one challenges you, are you still First Amendment auditing? I think that you are. Just because no one comes out and challenges you doesn't mean you're not there to test your First Amendment rights. And that's what I understood it was, is you're testing your rights under the First Amendment of the Constitution.
Perfect. And after you retired from your career in law enforcement, what drove you to actually try First Amendment auditing?
I had, like a lot of people, I fell down the rabbit hole of the whole Scientology thing. I saw the aftermath with Leah Remini and Mike Render, was a big fan of that. I was watching some videos on YouTube. A very large anti-Scientology YouTube channel was looking for someone who was former law enforcement to interview for some questions they had. That I had a very small channel. It was just about doing travel with my kids, and of course, the pandemic changed everything. And next thing I know, I go from 178 subscribers to my channel to over 1,000. And within 2 months, I'm at 5,000 people. So here I am. I've climbed up to where I'm almost 10,000 subscribers to my channel. And during the time, one of the things that really changed in the anti-Scientology movement was you had the appearance of people like Streets LA and Nasty Nathaniel that were actually picketing, protesting, and First Amendment auditing Scientology. And Nasty Nathaniel's actually the first person to ever audit Scientology. So during that, I got to know Nasty Nathaniel. I actually brought him on to interview him on my channel. We became friends, really good guy. And I had decided that I was going to go down to Clearwater, Florida, which is the heartbeat of Scientology now. It's where their biggest stuff is, it's where their leader lives. And there's another YouTuber that went down with me. And I decided that while I'm down there, I'm going to actually start auditing Scientology the way that Nasty Nathaniel did. And we did 2 days of auditing down there. And I got to say, Scientology actually passed. They didn't come out and confront us. They didn't swat us. They didn't call the police or anything like that. And so they got a pass on it. I think that they also realized there's nothing they can do. And then I came back home to Michigan, and there's a lady who's about 2 hours west of me who does a lot of auditing at the Battle Creek mission here in Michigan. So I went over there and I did some auditing with her at that location as well. And I thought it was fun. I thought it was a good time. I'm one of those that I'm not worried about confrontations. I'm there to test the boundaries of the First Amendment and see if they will be upheld.
Awesome. And what advice would you give to members of the public who may encounter a First Amendment auditor? Should they leave them alone? Should they approach them?
Well, I think that approaching them that's not a problem, but just remember, you don't know who you're talking to. You don't know what their reaction is going to be. If you come in civilly and you approach them civilly, hopefully you can have a conversation with them and you can learn about First Amendment auditing. And remember, it is a constitutional right if you are in a public space to be filmed. And a lot of people just don't get that. They think because I said I don't want you filming me, you don't have a right to film me. Well, the minute you step into a public space, someone has the right to film you. The government's going to be filming you. Every store you go into is going to be filming you. There are cameras on buildings everywhere you go. How many houses now have Ring cameras or Ring type cameras on their front door that are recording everything? Those videos are showing up all the time. If you think that because one person holding a camera or a cell phone on a gimbal is violating your rights, you need to open your eyes and you need to look around, because everything that you do is being filmed and you need to understand that fact. And if you're not going to be insulted by walking into a Walmart or a Home Depot and they're filming you in there, then why is it such a problem that somebody is walking by a store filming?
And what about employees of a post office or maybe a school district who are government employees and have to encounter a First Amendment auditor? Should they just let them do
School,
what they do, or how would you
schools have
advise them?
schools have different legislation. There's different laws protecting schools. Well, they're not protecting the schools; they're protecting the students. And I think that anybody that's going to be going and auditing a school needs to do so in a respectful manner, because it's not about your rights. What kind of commotion, what kind of disruption are you going to create in a school? And that's something that has to be explored more, is what actual rights do you have once you enter an area where children are at? Me personally, I would never audit a school. I don't want anything that's going to harm children or look inappropriate in any way. As to post office, that's a real weird one, because there's so many differing laws about the post office, and especially the fact that post office is a government organization while it's not a government organization. It's the U.S. Postal Service is such a strange setup. I'm thankful we got them. I love our post office, but it's really weird how everything is set up with the post office, and I'm not real familiar with all the laws concerning the post offices.
What are some locations that you know are typically illegal for a First Amendment auditor to film in?
Anywhere where you're going to have storage of personal data of people, anywhere that is actual private property, not open to the public. Well, it can even be open to the public, but they still have the right to refuse access to it anytime it's private property. That's something I see with some folks who do it in the First Amendment community, is they think that because a Lowe's is open to the public, the Lowe's doesn't have a right to stop them. Well, you're on private property. So you're telling me that you have the right to walk into my backyard and film me while I'm working in my backyard, and I don't have a right to make you leave. All private property is the same, whether it's owned by corporations or it's owned by individuals. Whoever has control of it has the right of who has access to it or not. So you have to remember those kinds of things. Malls can be the same way. A lot of people think, well, I can just go in and First Amendment audit a mall. Well, if the mall has problems with it, they can actually change the rules and they can put up whatever they want to say you can or cannot. Private property is private property. That's the way I look at it. Now, I'm sure there'll be people that say, "Oh, BS. It's open to the public, so I get to do whatever I want in there." Well, f around and find out. You know, that's how it's going to be.
This was one of the most searched queries on Google in relation to First Amendment auditors. It was, how can I stop someone from First Amendment auditing? And I know there's another question of whether you should or not, but how would you approach stopping someone from auditing?
As long as they're within their rights, I'm not even going to approach it. If they are within their legal rights, I wouldn't even approach trying to stop them. That's just the reality of it. I during my time since I got into the space of doing the anti-Scientology movement, there have been people that have, parked down the road with a camera with a big telephoto lens on it, taking photos of my home, taking photos of movement, people following me. And thing is that it's all in public space. I can't stop that. If even though I wanted to, they're still legally allowed to do it. I can't stop them.
If you could give one message to everybody in the United States in relation to the First Amendment and their rights, what would you want to tell them?
Learn your Constitution, learn your constitutional rights. The more that you know about your rights as a citizen, the more power that you have. And if you allow someone to violate your rights as an adult, just because you've simply refused to learn what your constitutional rights are, you got to think, do you really have, how are you doing on that? It's apparent. You need to learn your constitutional rights, because there are many times that people will look at someone who's an authority and just obey what they're told because they think that person has the right to do it. But if they don't have a right under the law or under the Constitution, they're violating your rights. I just watched a video out of Florida where a guy was sitting in his car and the police came up. The officer from point one it was almost like he was scared. He's screaming, he's yelling at this guy. I'm going to arrest you for drunk driving. Now I'm going to arrest you for resisting. And they couldn't arrest him for the drunk driving because he didn't have the keys to the car. He had no immediate ability to operate that vehicle. In most states, if an officer is committing an illegal arrest on you, you have a right to legally resist it. But know your laws. Don't just think that because you think it's not right, you can resist it. This guy, he got arrested. He got arrested for resisting. They had to drop the drunk driving charges on him because they couldn't prove that he had the ability to operate the motor vehicle. Just because you're sitting in a car and you're intoxicated, that's like I'm driving my friend home from the bar and he's intoxicated. So is he going to get arrested for driving while intoxicated? So that's the point, is if you don't have that ability, the officer was wrong. The officer really overstepped his bounds. He went way further in how aggressive he was in handling things. This guy, he got arrested. They arrested him for the drunk driving and for the resisting. They had to drop the drunk driving because there was no way of proving it. He never had the opportunity to operate the vehicle, which therefore it made the resisting arrest null and void as well, because they never had a right to put their hands on him. All right. Smart guy. He's now going to be suing that sheriff's department in Florida for a violation of his rights. And that's simply because he knew what his rights were, but he realized if I resist, I'm going to end up getting tased or pepper sprayed or possibly hurt. And instead of doing that, he was compliant with what happened. Now that department has to figure out how they're going to take care of this.
Wow, what a mess. And if he just had approached it maybe in a humble way, it wouldn't have escalated in that way.
Yeah, I mean, if the officer, literally the officer walked up and the first thing out of his mouth was, "Get out of the car." The guy's like, "What did I do?" He's legally parked on the street in front of his home. Was he intoxicated? Yeah, but he didn't have the keys to his car. He had no way of operating it. So the danger to the public is gone at that point. The only thing that you could really do about it is some cities have laws that say you can't sleep in your car. Okay, so it's a citation. All right, get him to his house, get him on in so he can at least go to bed or he can start sobering up. But there was no need just to walk right up to the window, start screaming at the guy. And then next thing you know, the guy's like, "What am I doing? What are you doing? Why are you doing this to me?" And next thing you know, the officer's got the taser pinned to his chest. "I'll taser you if you don't get out of the car." And, there's been many times I've watched taser deployments, completely justified. That one right there, that would have cost the department a lot of money. So
Wow.
that officer needs first off, that officer seems scared from the start. He needs to evaluate whether or not he really wants to be a police officer. and if he can handle those kinds of situations. And his department needs to have a serious talk with him.
Right. That's a great point.
Mhm.
Before the phenomena of First Amendment auditors existed,
Mhm.
were our rights ever at risk of being eroded?
Well, our rights are at risk every day. And, uh, one of the sayings that I hear very often that I truly believe is every right you give away to the government, you'll never get back. So it is imperative that we as citizens stand up for our rights. And first off, we have to know what our rights are. You have to know what your constitutional rights are. You have to know whether or not the government is overstepping their bounds and their boundaries in the way that they're handling things. And I, since the day that the Constitution and the amendments began becoming part of our society, there have been attempts to erode those rights. So it's always under fire. There's always someone looking at a way to get around things. We've got DAs that will, they hide evidence from people. That's violating people's rights. You have police officers do things they shouldn't be doing. You have corporations that are involved in things that they should never be involved in, and they're being protected by the government. But if, there was true transparency and everyone knew what was really going on behind the scenes, there would be a lot of people in trouble.
And would you
So
advise more people to get out there and flex their rights and become First Amendment auditors?
I would more that you know your rights. And if that's something you're interested in getting into and you want to be a First Amendment auditor, I always ask that if you're going to do anything like that, remember your safety and remember the safety of others. I like to see people, if you're going to do a First Amendment auditing, go with someone else. Have at least two people there, have two different pieces of equipment filming everything that's going on. If someone tells you turn your camera off, there's no way in the world I would do that. I've seen police officers walk up and say, turn your camera off. Well, the officer's got a camera right there on their chest that's filming everything. Why do I got to turn my camera off? I've seen that. Just make sure you cover your butt and make sure that you're safe about doing things. I don't like nasty. Something that I sometimes really don't like with Nasty is he films and then edits it and puts it up. I'd like to see more of the live streaming so that we know that if something happens in real time, you can get the appropriate response to him. Say someone comes out and attacks him. You see that on the live stream. You see that he's hurt. How many people that are watching that live stream are instantly calling for rescue services and police? So I would prefer that, but Nasty likes to record his stuff and he likes to edit it out. But I would prefer to see the live auditing. Even if you're recording the live auditing that you're doing and putting that out edited later, that's fine. But and he's also seen, he was in the situation. They did a documentary about the fact of how his rights were violated there in California. So he knows firsthand what can happen.
With that case that you just referenced, I believe it was the chief of police in Morro Bay.
Yeah, that was, I was trying to, yeah, that was sickening to say the least.
How did that chief of police act inappropriately? And if you were in that position at that police department, how would you have handled the situation differently?
Well, I think that there's a lot of things that people don't realize about law enforcement. Number one, law enforcement can lie to you. They can lie to you all day long. All right. If I'm investigating a crime, say if I'm investigating you for a crime, say you walked across your neighbor's yard and I'm going to be investigating it and I'm going to be talking to you. I could sit there and lie to you and go, man, I could walk through that yard all the time. I don't know why they keep getting so upset about it. And, that's part of trying to get people to open up to you and admit to things that they've done. And you're sitting there like, yeah, I know. It's the easiest way. I mean, I have to walk around, there you go. Now you're facing a charge. I can lie to you. But if you lie to a law enforcement officer purposefully, it's considered obstruction of justice. You can actually be charged with it. So a lot of people need to realize those things. When you're watching the Morro Bay, they came up, they're talking to Nasty about several different things about from, I think, television shows to just a broad spectrum of things. The whole purpose of that was trying to get him into a zone where he felt comfortable with them. Like, oh, they're just here chatting with me. They're my bros. We're good. And the problem with that is I don't see a problem with how they handled it, but the whole purpose of it seemed like it was nothing more than that the secretary who was in there, she got offended and she got mad. So they had to do something to defend that. And they completely went out of line. Nasty was 100% within his rights to do what he was doing. And Morro Bay knows that now. And there was a lot of problems that came out of that. But, they handled it from start to finish completely wrong. It's one thing to walk up and talk to them, get their information. If they're willing to give it to you, just find out what's going on. Make sure, okay, there's no problem here. They're just exercising their First Amendment. They should have never been on him like they were from the start. I think they violated it from beginning to end. They knew what they wanted to do. They wanted to arrest him. They wanted to shut him down and stop him from filming. What's the big deal? What was he going to discover in Morro Bay? Dirty floors, I mean, there was nothing there. So I don't understand the whole purpose of why they acted the way they did.
And I know shortly after Nasty Nathaniel was arrested, the community came and swarmed outside and were protesting, which eventually led the chief of police to retire shortly after. Do you think those two events were directly correlated?
Oh, yeah, I would say so. I mean, oftentimes when you see an officer's involved in something that they could possibly get in trouble for and they retire, that is to keep them from either being terminated or facing disciplinary action within their department. So when I see someone who does something like what they did with Nathaniel there in Morro Bay, and then when you see they literally swatted a hornet's nest, and the hornets came out in force. So they have all this public pressure that's on them. And you have to remember, nowadays you have YouTubers who get more views than the news does, than CNN, Fox News, MSNBC. You have YouTubers get more views on their content than those channels that are out there. So, I mean, take someone like Joe Rogan. I saw a study where it said that Joe Rogan gets more views of his content than all three of those combined.
Wow.
Yeah. So if, a lot of people used to think, oh, well, you're just going to put it up on the internet. Your 100 fans are going to see it. So what? Well, nowadays it goes up, and a lot of people, instead of watching mainstream media, they're now watching YouTube to try to get what, a lot of people think that they can't trust the media to give them the true facts on things. So they're watching YouTube and unedited stories, and they're seeing what's going on. And so now, instead of it's 100 or 200 or maybe 1,000 people saw it, now you got millions of people who are watching YouTube and watching the content that's being put out there. So they really had pressure on them. There were people coming out in droves over that one. And that chief of police was looking at, most chiefs of police are in an appointed position. So you're appointed by whoever the city or township administrators are. And they have, in most contracts for chief of police, they have a right to remove you at any time for any reason. So instead of facing, any disciplinary action or possibly even termination, resign or retire.
So that actually leads into my final questions, and they're about the auditor community, all the viewers out there. I've seen some auditors, they'll actually dox the employees or the places where they audit, where they considered the audit a fail. What are your thoughts on that? And is that legal for people to call and harass and make death threats?
Well, I've been retired for a couple of years now. I'm not up to date on the doxing laws. I personally don't dox anybody. That's my viewpoint on it. Why are you doxing someone? And if you'll notice, it's oftentimes people who do the doxing are the ones who throw the biggest fits when people they've doxed turn around and do the same thing to them. There's a very hypocritical feeling to that. And why would you dox someone if that person ends up getting injured or their property destroyed because you put their information out there? Are you going to face criminal and possibly civil results from that? Could you end up losing everything that you've got because you got mad at somebody and doxed them? I think about it every day. My daughter is a VTuber, and she's like a lot of VTubers. Her identity she keeps separate. That's why you never see her on my channel, because she doesn't have that kind of identity. She doesn't want her public identity out there. Me personally, I'm a old, ugly, retired cop. I don't care. Everybody knows me. So the thing is that why would you do that when you have someone who wants their identity not to be known? Why would you do something that could put them in danger? And we've all seen, I mean, there was the young man, I think he was out of Canada or California, who was swatting people all over the country, ended up with someone actually dead because of it. And his thing was, well, it was just a joke. Yeah, well, not to that guy's family, and now that kid's in prison for it. All right. People do insane things. They do things out of anger, and you can't control that. And if you give them a tool to hurt someone, that's on you. No matter how much you say, well, I told them this is their information, but don't do anything about it. You put it out there, and you may be the one that faces the consequences for it.
And what about the viewers and subscribers themselves? Are they at legal risk if they're taking action against some of these places?
Well, if you damage someone's property or injure someone, you can face the criminal charges for it. You can also face civil charges for it. And that's one of the things. And I think that a lot of people need to remember that even with the First Amendment auditing, it's not being done to you. You're not the one that's out there being confronted by people. You're not the one who is having this problem with these folks. If you want to go and you want to try to audit the place yourself, you know the risks going in because you just saw what happened to another auditor. But if you go and attack someone because you don't like the way that they reacted to another auditor, could they be having a bad day? Think within yourself. Have you ever done things because you were having a bad day? It could be, you don't know what that person's situation is. You don't know what caused them to act that way. A good example is I went to a scene, guys tearing his house apart. And I get there, another officer just wants to lock him up and just throw him right in jail. He's out of control. He needs to be taken care of. I get the guy to calm down and find out his child had just passed away from cancer.
Wow.
The guy's heart was so broken, and what he was doing that was the only way he could let it out. So I'm going to throw a guy in jail who just lost his child and is absolutely destroyed by it because instead of taking a moment to actually talk to them, and finding out the truth. So think about that. If you're one of those that are inclined to go after somebody because you don't like the way that they acted during a First Amendment audit or something you saw on the internet, also keep in mind, was what you saw edited? Is it possible that things could have been edited out of that video that make the auditor look like they were the ones that were in the right when they could have been egging this on the whole time? You have to be careful and be mindful. I don't want to see anybody going to jail because they made a bad decision. Just think things through.
And we've covered a lot of ground here today. I think you've answered over 20 of my questions. Is there anything that you feel that we missed that may be important on the subject?
Not really. Just remember, think about it from the standpoint of if you're auditing and the way you're acting, would you want someone else doing that to your grandmother, your grandfather, your mother, your father, your sister, your brother, or even your children or your wife or your husband? Would you want them treating your family the way that you treat other people? That's why when I go out there, I try to be respectful because that is someone's mom. That is someone's dad. That is someone's son or daughter. And if it could happen to them, it can happen to my family. And so I always try to treat people with a modicum of respect. Now, if you choose to take being respected and treated properly and turn it into something else, that's on you. But I'm always going to come with respect first, and we'll go from there.